Hi guys, I'm Owen, and today I'm going to show you how to do some hand sewing techniques, as well as how to choose needles, how to choose thread, and even how to thread a needle. Hand sewing is so great because it's something that you can take anywhere you go, and it's a really useful skill to have for making repairs or adding embellishments to things. So let's get started. So here we have some examples of different threads you might use when hand sewing and the needles that are best suited to them. So here is a sashiko thread, which is a multi-stranded sort of chunkier thread. And for that you might use a sashiko needle, which has a large eye but a pointy tip. If you're using wool, which is often used to sew a wool garment together when you're joining seams, or for doing tapestry, then you might use a chenille needle, which has an even bigger eye and a pointy tip. Or if you don't need that pointy tip because you're sewing wool to wool, you might use this large needle that has a blunt tip but a very large eye. If you are doing some hand quilting, there is a thread like this, which is slightly waxed, so it gives a nice even finish and means you can use long strands of it without it breaking. And for that you might use this very dainty gold eye quilting needle, which is very small with a very small eye. But for most of your sewing you will be using just a standard cotton or polyester thread, and for that a pack of assorted needles will do you just great. So once you've chosen your needle and thread for your project, it will be time to thread your needle. So make sure that whatever thread you're using, you've got a nice clean end, and you can do that with scissors. Just snip it off to make sure it's a nice clean end and not fraying. And if you are threading it just by hand, by eye, you'll just want to pass that thread through the eye of your needle. Get right up close so that it doesn't wiggle around too much. There we go. Just get it popped through and then you can pull it through. Now that's all well and good if you've got a nice big eye and if you've got good eyesight, but if you've got a smaller eye, things can get a little tricky, and that's where a needle threader comes really in handy. So again, I'm going to cut some thread. And now with the needle threader, you can see here it's got this bit of wire at the end. And that wire goes through the eye of the needle. And because it's wire, it's nice and stiff. So it goes through quite easily. So here I just pop it through. There we go. See? And now what we can do is we can put our thread up through that hole here and loop it over so that it doesn't come out. And now pull the needle threader back through the eye of your needle. And now you've threaded even a fine-holed needle. So that is how to thread a needle. The first stitch I'm going to show you is the running stitch. The running stitch is the most useful stitch to have in your arsenal, and it's also the simplest stitch. It's great for joining two pieces of fabric together, or perhaps hemming a garment, or even just making simple repairs. And today I'm going to use black thread here so that you can see exactly what I'm doing. And I've got my needle and thread. I have cut it longer than the length of what I'm going to sew so that there's some buffer for me to move around. And I'm going to tie a knot in one end. Just a very simple knot, so take it over and under and then pull it taut. And because it's quite fine thread and it makes quite a small knot, I'm going to tie two more of these little knots to build it up so that the thread doesn't just pull straight through. So there we go. Now I've got 3 little knots. So now I'm going to take the two pieces that I'm sewing together. I'm going to line up the edges. And then with my needle, I'm just going to go and sew straight through the two pieces of fabric. Pull it through. You can see my knot is nice and secure. And then I'm going to come up from the back of the two pieces and pull it up. And I'm going to keep doing this, going through the 2 layers, pulling it, and then back. And a quicker way to do this, especially if you've got a nice small piece like this, is to just take your needle and go through and up and through and up. And you can do that several times. You can see it's gone through the other side. Do that several times and then pull your thread through. So I will just do that all the way to the end. And if you're sewing 2 pieces together like this, just make sure that you're keeping the edges of your seam nice and even. That way you'll have a nice straight piece once you finish. So now I will go all the way to the end. And you'll notice my stitch length. I would estimate that that's 4 millimeters if you want an exact number. Don't do them too big or you might not have a very secure seam. Too small is going to be sturdier, but it will be more work. This is a good sort of middle ground. So now I have got to the end and I'm going to tie some knots here, just like I did at the start. So this time I will use my needle to guide me. So I'm going to put my needle under my thread and then bring it up and then pull it tight. And I'm using my thumb here to keep the tension nice and even, to stop it from pulling my thread like that, because we want to make sure that our fabric doesn't get puckered. So again, I'm going to do a few of these little knots. So there's knot number 2. And knot number 3. Lovely. And now I'm going to trim my thread. And there we have it. My 2 pieces of fabric have been sewn together. And if I press my seams, it will look like that, which is lovely. Now, let's say you aren't sewing 2 pieces of fabric together. Let's say you are maybe hemming some trousers or a skirt, something like that. So here I've got a little example of, this is just 1 piece of fabric, but here I've folded the edges over. So the principle is exactly the same. This time I've got a needle. I've decided to use a double strand of thread to make it extra secure. So I've threaded it through my needle and then I've doubled back on myself. And this time I'm taking the 2 ends together and then tying my knot, so that when I sew, it will be 2 threads together instead of just 1. And again, I'm going to do 3 little knots just to make sure it's nice and secure. And there we go. And now I'm going to sew here where my fabric has been folded up. If you have a big piece, you might want to use some pins to hold it in place, but this is a nice, small, manageable piece. So again, I'm just going to pop the needle through and then bring it up, pull it through, and I'm just going to keep doing that all the way to the end. This is quite a big needle. So actually I could probably get quite a few back and forth stitches going. And I find hand sewing so relaxing. It's a really pleasant activity to do. And it's great because you don't need a power source like a sewing machine. You can do it anywhere. And all you need is a needle and thread and maybe a little pair of scissors. And then you'll be well prepared wherever you go. Now, this stitch will be visible on both sides. So it's good to think about thread color and also just being, a bit nice and tidy. There we go. So I've gone all the way to the end. And you can see this is what it looks like on the reverse. it's actually quite sweet. You could turn the stitching into a real detail on whatever it is you're sewing, if it's a pair of trousers or a skirt or anything. And then now, same as before, I'm just going to tie my little knots. So again, needle goes under and up. Use my finger to make sure it doesn't tighten the stitching I've just done. And I'm going to do 3 of those knots. There we go. And now I'll trim my tail. And there we go. That is the running stitch. This next stitch is the slip stitch, and it is perfect for hemming something when you want the stitching to be invisible. So I'm using white fabric and black thread so that you can really see what I'm doing. And I have got my piece folded over once and then twice, so that there's a nice clean edge with no fraying here. And now what I'm going to do, I'm going to come up close so that you can really see. I've got my needle threaded and with a knot at the end. You see how we've got that fold there? I'm first going to go between that fold and come up here. And I'm going to pull it up like that so that my knot is concealed. You can't see it at the front or the back. And now what I'm going to do, I'm just going to take a little bit of fabric down and up, and that's in the front bit, the front of your fabric. I'm going to pull that through. And then now I'm going to come back here and pass my needle under and through where that fold is. So I'm going to go along and then bring my needle back up. And then do just as I did before. I'm going to leave this loose so that you can see it a moment. I'm going to go through my front and just do a little tiny stitch. I could go even smaller, let's be honest. There we go. Pull my thread through. And then come back and push my needle under that fold. And this way you can see nearly all of my stitching is concealed in this fold, apart from some tiny little bits that are visible at the front. So now I'm going to take my thread and I'm going to pull it taut so that you can see what it will look like. There we go. So that is almost invisible from the back. And from the front, we've just got those 2 tiny stitches. And if I were to be using white thread, they would be almost completely invisible. They would blend in with my fabric. So I will keep doing this, taking just a little bit from the front, coming up, and then going down into my fold, and then coming up. It's a lovely dainty stitch. There we go, that is the slip stitch. So sometimes you want your stitching to be as invisible as possible, like with the slip stitch. But sometimes you want your stitching to be as visible as possible, like the blanket stitch. The blanket stitch is quite a fun detail that you can do on the edge of a piece of fabric. And because it doesn't actually seal the edges from fraying, it's good to do it on maybe something like a felt that doesn't fray to begin with, or on an edge that has already been folded over and closed, like I've got here. So because it's such a beautiful bold stitch, I am using a multi-stranded embroidery thread for this, and in a very contrasting color so that it really stands out. It's more like an embellishment really than a kind of utilitarian stitch. So I've got a needle with a nice big eye and a pointy tip, and I have threaded an ample amount because you need more than just the length of your piece in thread, because it's used several times round. So I've threaded my needle, I've tied my knot, and Here we go. So bring your needle up. You want to do, it depends what you're doing, but here I'm going to do maybe 1 centimeter away from the edge to start. So I'm going to bring my needle up and pull it taut. There we go. And now I'm going to come through probably about 1 centimeter away and still 1 centimeter up. Bring my needle up, but then I'm going to loop my tail like so that I have pulled my tail over, and then do exactly the same thing over by about 1 centimeter, up by about 1 centimeter. If you were doing a finer detailed blanket stitch edge, change those measurements absolutely. So I've got my needle up, and then again, just make sure that my end is wrapped around it and pull that through. And you can see it's a blanket stitch because it's wrapping itself around just like a blanket. And you can keep going and then tidy up the tension as you go along. So once you come to the end of your blanket stitch, take your thread and instead of moving over to the next stitch, just do a little stitch right behind where you've just come up. And then this will close that little loop. There we go. And that's so nice and tidy. And then turn it over and tie a couple knots just to secure your end. And there you have the blanket stitch. This next stitch is the chain stitch, and this is a lovely decorative stitch that you can do. And to do it, I've got my needle. I'm using a multi-stranded embroidery thread so you can really see what I'm doing. Bring your needle up through your fabric. And then what we're going to do is take your needle, put it right back through that hole you've just created, and then come down the length of the stitch that you want and pull it through, but wrapping your thread under your needle. Just like that. Lovely. And then we're going to do the same thing again, this time coming through that hole that you've just come up through, bringing your needle down, keeping your thread under your needle, and then pulling it through. And just keep going as long as you want. So I'm going to do one more, and then I will show you. Once you have finished, just pop your needle through so that you are securing that last loop that you do. And then you can tie your knot on the back. And that is the chain stitch. Possibly the most useful thing to know how to hand sew is a button. How to sew on a button. We've all lost buttons, and knowing how to sew them on is invaluable. So what I've got here is I've got a nice pointy needle. I have threaded it with red thread to match the button I'm sewing on, and I have folded my thread back on itself, lining up the two ends. And now I'm going to tie a knot in the end. And the reason I'm double stranding it is because I want it to be really nice and strong. So here I'm tying one knot and another knot and a third for luck to make sure it doesn't pull through. And you can see the knot I'm doing, I'm just folding my tail over and under and pulling it through. And here we go. So I'm going to hold my button in place and I'm going to come up through one of the holes. And if you kind of poke your needle around, you'll soon find where the right spot is. So there we go, coming up. Now I'm going to do diagonally over through that hole and come down. And I'm going to then come up through the previous hole and over and down. Now I'm going to do the other diagonal direction. So I'm going to come up through, let's find it, there we go, come up through that hole and then diagonally down through that hole. And again, up and down. So now I've got 2 stitches in both directions. And depending on how you feel, you can do more. You might want to do 4 or 5 just to make sure the button is very secure. And once you have finished doing however many stitches you want to do, up and down, just turn your piece over. Use your needle to guide tying your knot. So put your needle under and up through your thread. Tie it tight, and I'm going to do this a few times just like I did when I started my button. And that was how to do a 4-holed button. If you have a button with just 2 holes, ta-da! If you have 2 holes like this type of button, it's the exact same thing, but this time you'll just be working between those 2 holes. And that is how to sew on a button. Well, I really hope you enjoyed that video and that you are now feeling confident enough to do some hand sewing of your own. If you did enjoy it, be sure to like and subscribe to Love Crafts and leave a comment below. Thanks!